Herein, we will briefly go over democracy as a form of government. We will go over the evolution of governments as touched upon by various economists and philosophers like John Locke and Sir Robert Filmer. So, Sir Winston Churchill stated that it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms. Uh, well, I would beg to differ from Sir Winston Churchill, uh, because I believe that this is rather inaccurate. And to see how, let us look at the evolution of government. If we study the history and evolution of governments, we will see fairly quickly where democracy stands. Locke and Sir Robert Filmer speak of how governments emerged from a state of nature where there was anarchy. Anarchy, for the purposes of this discussion, refers to its etymological denotation, which stems from its root words an for no, archon for leader, meaning absence of a leader or no leader. So anarchy means no leadership. Therefore, uh, since anarchy means lack of a leader, the state of nature is where people may make up and live by their own rules and take the laws into their own hands because there are no laws and no enforcement of the laws, and there is no leadership. Uh, So Sir Robert Filmer and Locke then speak of how out of the state of nature or anarchy, the family emerged where there was some form of leadership. There were the family unit with its leaders being the parents, the father or the mother, the matriarch or the patriarch, or the guardians of uh, a nuclear family who made all the informal and formal laws and enforced them as well. From the family emerged tribes with its elders and chiefs, and even its basic law enforcement. And from the tribes emerge as human settlement and human trust grew in leadership. From the tribes emerged a more complex city, uh, and the trust and good leadership eventually gave rise to mayors and then governors and statesmen and kings or monarchs. And now here is what will give us the insight about the emergence of democratic forms of government. If from anarchy, increasing trust and equality results in families, from families, increasing trust and fairness results in tribes. From tribes, increasing trust and fairness results in city-states. And these city-states are governed by their leaders or their monarchs in whom the people trust. How then do democracies emerge? If a briefly, if a society encounters misfortune like oppression and misguidance, it begins to have disparity or inequity, um, which is a decline in equality, um, and and this inequality creates mistrust, and as trust plummets, so does the legitimacy of the monarch. At this point, kings or the leadership becomes increasingly controversial. Why is that? Why does nearly every decision of a monarch become increasingly controversial in a disparate, unequal, unjust society with lowered levels of trust between citizens? You see, in a homogeneous society, a healthy society, people are more likely to trust and agree with one another. In a disparate, traumatized, unhealthy, and unequal society with increasing levels of inequality and mistrust and competing and contradictory special interests, every decision of the monarch or leadership is bound to upset one group or party or another, with accumulated grievances over every decision of the monarch. The grudges may gather, and the leadership becomes increasingly unpopular. As the leadership becomes increasingly unpopular and beleaguered, the leadership attempts to distribute the blame of decision making and attempts to add representatives of the increasingly disparate, heterogeneous, and disparate elements of society in an attempt to appear more just and fair. But this is just a palliative measure and is not addressing the underlying cause of the problem, which is increased disparity and inequalities. As the people splinter into factions and groups, so does the leadership. So we see that our monarchy may devolve into an aristocracy or an oligarchy, which may eventually devolve into um, democracy and eventually, God forbid, much worse. So thus we start from um, a civilized, healthy, homogeneous society with order and a working government. As a society divides into special interest groups and grievances mount, as community may fracture into gangs led by gangsters, there may arise mobsters with their uh, own mobs and the resulting breakdown of leadership and a weaker government results. Uh, so you see that with a weaker government, the people continue splintering into smaller and smaller subgroups, and the next stage is division into the nuclear family unit. In such a society, people begin to prefer their own families over the larger society. This fracturing into families gives rise to family loyalties, which have historically been documented uh, as giving rise to Il Familia or the mafias of Sicily in southern Italy, as documented by Edward Banfield. Uh, to repeat, with increasing divisiveness and disparity, everything the ruler says or does offends one person or another. As a result, when society becomes increasingly fractious, decisions are made not by righteous leadership but by mob rule or majority rule, that is, by voting. This is democracy, which is a last ditch effort to have some semblance of order, hence, democracy being the government of last resort and the product of grave misfortune. Hence, democracy seems to be the nearest to anarchy, for at this point there is effectively no leadership because, as noted previously, the leadership has long fractured in the name of representation. These observations may be supported by historical use cases which we will go over in subsequent presentations. But for now, we want to go over an overarching trend or pattern. Uh, at this point, we may also ask what may cause this degeneration. Now we may ask how does this process of decline begin? Uh, so we'll go over this in more detail, but there's a feedback loop involved when it comes to devolution of societies from order and government to disorder, trying to hold on to some semblance of unity through government of last resort, that is democracy. Again, this process is gleaned from observing a number of historical use cases, which we will go into in the next part of this series, if there is interest from the audience. So, as we observe this process, observe a loop, which is a reinforcing mechanism which accelerates um, the decline of a society into democracy and worse, God forbid, anarchy. First, I would like to begin, as with all things, from the seeming ignition point of this decline, abstaining from doing the right thing due to lack of resources available for healing, recovery, etc. Please note this abstinence is not necessarily inaction, but it is unrighteous conduct. It may also be vigilante action, for example, in misguided countries where you may be denied service if you are a political nonconformist. What is worse than unrighteous conduct? What is worse is passing off unrighteous acts or misdeeds with sophistry, passing apathy or indifference for kindness, or inaction or indifference for benevolence. An example is passing racial disparity as racial diversity, passing poverty and human suffering as multiculturalism, finding refuge in relativism as opposed to having standards about what is right and what is incorrect. When we begin to pass wrong as right and vice for virtue, at this point, inequity or vice prevails in society. In other words, as a result, inequality increases. This inequality is inequality in race, for example. Some are tall, white, blonde, educated, wealthy, blue eyed, slim, athletic, and healthy, while others are short or obese or malnourished, poor, poorly educated, brown, black, yellow, or exhibiting clear symptoms of race harm. What is worse is that as this inequality prevails, the sophistry, insincerity, and performative outlook, as pointed out previously, attempts to convince everyone that there is no inequality and that the tall, white, blonde person is the same as the malnourished, oppressed, abused, ethnic, non white folk. Now that inequity or injustice or inequality prevails, we begin to see the fractious groups divided into clans, which begin to view each other with increased suspicion. In other words, when inequality, vice, etc., prevails, mistrust increases between the cliques. Be they divided into, say, the Italian mafia or the pink mafia or the communist agents or the variety of special interest groups contesting for power as a result of inequality and division and heterogeneity as opposed to homogeneity and a natural unity that arises from righteousness and justice and equal blessings. Now, after inequality gives rise to mistrust between members of society, people begin to now mistrust the leadership. People start questioning and blaming the leadership, be the leadership be composed of the king, their president, or quote unquote politicians. It does not stop there. Such societies begin to resist any leaders in their society, be they teachers, parents, or policemen. Everyone becomes suspect, and as a result, the leadership and the very government of that society weakens. Attempts at reforming the government are made. Representatives are elected at this point, which dilutes the government, and discontent makes it more likely that a demagogue or misleading influence will take control. As leadership cannot satisfy everyone, mistakes are made, and these mistakes convince the people to agitate even more, further weakening the government. The more the leadership tries to make decisions, the more it upsets one disparate group or another. The more people want to take control of the government and take matters into their own hands or threaten to devolve into a democracy. In other words, the misfortunes which breed anarchy amplify themselves by feeding upon themselves to encourage chaos, entropy, and democratic forms of government. Unfortunately, when society comes to a point where it is so disparate, unequal, unjust, or heterogeneous, or or where uh, one segment of society or another mistrusts leadership decisions, the leadership is less likely to make uh, courageous, risky, and righteous decisions. In other words, the leadership begins to abstain from engaging in righteous conduct in favor of diplomatic acts, or worse, in favor of inaction, or worse, in favor of which actions which try to please the largest segment of society, because society is unfortunately degenerating into a democracy, or worse, God forbid. This results in a leadership which aims to please the mobs, and that is uh, that is the greatest the attempt to please the mobs instead of doing the righteous thing is the greatest argument for removal of any remaining lovers of a nation that may still arise to rescue their peoples from error. It effectively discourages the return of a society to an oligarchy or monarchy. We noticed that the lack of people taking initiative or engaging in righteous conduct results in a chain reaction of many negative events. We begin to see people make excuses for inaction, or for vigilante action. Inequity and inequality prevails, and we see that uh, uh, as a result of the inequity and inequality, there is increased mistrust, and the mistrust in combination with the injustices weakens the leadership or government. This decline has the obvious result of economic underdevelopment. What is really awful about poverty is that um, it further diminishes the ability of the righteous to uh, safely take risks and engage in righteous conduct. In other words, increased poverty results in increased aversion to righteous acts. So, is it true that democracy is the worst form of government? Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that democracy is a government of near last resort. Democracy is the result of a series of misfortunes, resulting in the degeneration of the government and its apparatus. In other words, democracy may not be the ideal form of government, perhaps. I appreciate you viewing this video, and I hope you come back for further if there is further interest.